I'm Maggie McGrath with Forbes Breaking News. There is a growing partisan divide among men and women in the United States, and this is especially true among people who are divorced. Joining us now is the man who conducted this research and knows a lot about it, Daniel Cox. He is the director of the Survey Center on American Life, and he is also a research fellow on polling and public opinion at the American Enterprise Institute. Daniel, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the top line finding. You found that 56% of men who are divorced say that they will vote for former President Trump in the 2024 presidential election. And that's a higher percentage than men who are married and men who are single. Did this result surprise you?
It did. I think for one reason particularly is that this is not a group of voters that we pay a lot of attention to. We pay a lot of attention to single voters, men and women, and married voters, but this divorce group of voters is not one that we really know that much about, and so it was surprising in that regard, particularly because the polarization between them was bigger than we've seen among other groups.
Talk about that divide. You say this divide is new, and I think it's something like 42% of divorced women say that they're voting for Trump. So what is causing this divide?
So I think there's a number of things that I would point to. One is that we did some polling that found that the issue of divorce is particularly resonant among men who think that they're at a disadvantage in American society today. There's a growing number of men who feel this way. And we asked a question of whether Americans thought that men or women are more advantaged by the justice system when it comes to divorce. Do divorce courts treat men or women better? And men overwhelmingly believe, all men, but particularly divorced men, believe that divorce courts favor women in their proceedings. And so I think that experience of going through divorce and dealing with lawyers and possibly court proceedings plays into this worldview where men believe that they're increasingly on the defensive.
Plays into a worldview where men believe they're on the defensive. Let's dive into that a little bit more. How exactly do they think that divorce courts are not addressing their needs? And also, how do they think the two presidential candidates will play to their needs? What has former President Trump proposed that this constituent of voters want to see in American society?
Well, I don't think it has to do with any particular policy, particularly when we're talking about this issue. But I do think it has a lot to do with Trump sort of hearing them and expressing their frustrations and even some amount of grievance about how American society has shifted so quickly and dramatically to represent the interests of women in a lot of situations, but then forgotten the challenges that men face. And you saw this actually shortly after the Me Too movement, when there was all this concern about this ongoing, really significant problem with sexual harassment and assault in the United States. And one of the first things Trump said is like, well, what about the men? Like, we should be mindful of how the situation could impact their lives.
Interesting. So does this divide start with the Me Too movement, or does it predate 2017?
Well, a lot of things that we've seen in the polling data seem to originate around 2016, 2017. And I'll share just two trends with you, which I think are really compelling. The first is that for young women, they become increasingly liberal around that time. And so the gender divide among Gen Z occurs 2016, 2017, and expands shortly thereafter. And so you have young women becoming much more liberal and young men kind of remaining the same. The other thing that happens around that same time period is women become increasingly dissatisfied with the way women are being treated in American society. Gallup has polls going back roughly 2 decades where asked, are you satisfied with the way women are treated? And for the most part, men and women were feeling fairly okay. But again, around 2016 and around 2017, there's a precipitous decline in how women are feeling, whereas men don't show much evidence of change at all.
That's interesting, and it kind of makes sense if you've been following political news that it goes back to that moment in time, 2016. So you mentioned Gen Z. I want to break down the demographics of your research. So it was 56% of men who are divorced say they are voting for Trump. Let's start with age demographics. How does that change among Gen Z, Millennial, Gen X, and Boomer men? Is it 56% across the board, or is one of those age groups higher than another?
So one of the fascinating things is that the political gender divide is, you see it across generations, right? That historically men have been somewhat more Republican and conservative than women, and you can see that in their voting records. But among this generation, we're seeing a 17-point, 18-point political divide in their candidate choice, which is much smaller among older generations. So the Gen Zers are seeing are in far different places, men and women, than they are among millennials and Gen X and baby boomers, even if overall some of those folks are more conservative.
So say that one more time. Is the gender divide is greatest among Gen Z and not boomers? Did I hear that right?
Yeah, so the gender divide is definitely larger among Gen Z than it is among older generational cohorts, even if the baby boomers overall, men and women, are slightly more Republican and more conservative than younger. The gap is bigger. And I think part of the reason is that young women are so much more liberal and democratic.
And I imagine, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but this creates a vicious cycle wherein there is a divide in political opinions. And then if people feel like they can't talk to each other, does that exacerbate the divide? Have you found a worsening effect in your research?
Yeah, we found in some of our research when it comes to dating and relationships and even friendships that younger liberal women in particular report some sense of aversion and hesitancy to date even moderate men, but particularly conservative men. And one of the really fascinating things is that when you look at a whole number of political issues, from gun control and abortion and climate change and healthcare, single women and young women tend to care about these issues a lot, and young men seem not simply more conservative, but much more apathetic.
And what about demographic differences in your research across ethnic categories? So Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, Island Pacific Americans. Is the divorce divide present among those groups too, or how did that break down in your research?
Yeah, we weren't able to disaggregate racial and ethnic differences in the marital divide, but overall, you do see significant gender divides among each of those different racial and ethnic groups, but it's most pronounced among white Americans.
Most pronounced among white Americans.